Chapter 2. Jewish Magic. There shall not be found among you an observer of the times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 10. In Arab tradition, the Jews were the greatest magicians of all times. In the Middle Ages of Europe, too, both the Jewish rank and file and the Christians among whom they lived, more often than not, looked up to some reputed sorcerer of Hebrew origin as a miracle worker. The Jews, on their part, frequently described Jesus as a magician, but that is neither here nor there. As to whether Hebraic magic is an original product of this Semitic people, it would almost be impossible to decide, without knowing what part of their magical heritage was of foreign origin. There can be no doubt that magic has been very widely practiced among the Jews. Justly or unjustly, literally thousands of codices attribute their roots to Hebrew origins, and Moses himself was a magician in one sense of the word. According to the Samaritans, all magical teaching stems from one book, the Book of Signs, which Adam brought with him from paradise, to enable him to have power over the elements and invisible things. As the Book of Raziel, this work is still extant, if indeed it is the same one. Raziel, meaning secret of God, is supposed to be the real transmitter of secrets. His book claims to have come from Adam. In another place, the reader is informed that it was entrusted to Noah just before he entered the ark. Like many other magical texts, it traces its history to Solomon, son of David, giant among miracle workers. Bibliographical research has so far been able to do little in tracing the history of the Book of Raziel. Containing a very large number of magical figures, signs, and instructions for making talismans, it claims originally to have been engraved upon a tablet of sapphire, though only recent copies are available for study. The Apocryphal Book of Enoch is another work claiming intellectual descent from Solomon and Moses. As in other fields of historical research, there seems little doubt that some of the books which are thought to be typical of Jewish magical texts are at best badly interpolated. In other cases, substitution may have taken place. Many scholars believe that much of the Jewish magical ritual contained in ancient manuscripts has been lost. For not only was rabbinical hostility to be faced by Hebraic sorcerers, but sometimes the fury of the people of the country in which they lived, often as a minority of their race. Their aid may have been invoked time and time again as rainmakers by the Moors and the Poles, but should anything go wrong, they were generally blamed. Then the law of transmission, whereby only very few could be initiated into the mysteries, may have prevented the writing down of such magical lore. The Book of Enoch has the following legend in explanation of how magic came to the Jews. Two angels, Uzzah and Azael, one of them adopted later by the pagan Arabs as a god and the other as an angel, were sent by God to tempt mortals as a test of human frailty. Being themselves unfortunately overcome by love for a woman, they were condemned to divine punishment. The one hangs from the heavens, head downwards, the other lies chained beyond the dark mountains. He it was, incidentally, who taught women to paint their faces. The books of Hermes, said by some to be 42 in number, were the attributed work of the Egyptian god Thoth, and they were certainly used by Jewish magicians, as a multitude of references amply show. Thoth is called Thuth by Plato, who states that he was a man of great wisdom who lived in Egypt. It is upon his works, we are told, that the ancient Egyptians based their religion and widespread magical practices. Who was Thoth or Thuth, and what were his magical discoveries? Cicero takes up the tale and tells us that he was indeed a man of Thebes, a lawgiver. The teachings of the books of Hermes that are extant out of a reputed 42 to 36,525 volumes, according to your source, seem at first sight to be confused, mystical, contradictory, and magical. Are they Egyptian? This has been very seriously doubted. It is likely that the works of Thoth were, as used to be the practice, transcribed, edited, and passed on in a more or less altered form. That they now contain traces of Christian, Muslim, and Gnostic thinking seems to be obvious. I have, however, met active supporters of the thesis that these are prophetic writings, and some maintain that their real meaning is clothed in esoteric symbolism. If this be the case, it would surely need more than a lifetime to unravel it without some sort of initiation, so Thoth remains an almost closed book. The Zohar is another important work of Jewish magic. Full of demons and spirits, hells and devils, it gained wide currency in Europe in the 14th century. Perhaps it is this work, and the Kabbalistic school which it stimulated, which may be regarded as the greatest single force in giving the Jews their fame as magicians in the West. It is through Jewish sources, or from texts claiming Jewish inspiration, that most of the sacrificial and propitiatory rites of what we now call high magic are to be traced. The fumigation and incense, candles and knives, the pentacles, even most of the words used in the ceremonies, parallel Hebrew religious procedures in a manner not dissimilar to the parodying of the Christian Mass by black magicians. The Book of Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage is one of many borderline works. With the reputed authorship of one Abraham, son of Simon, first produced about the year 1458, it may be the work of a Christian, yet it clearly owes much to Hebrew magical tradition. It is probably, in fact, a mixture, the work of a Christian initiate in Oriental magical art. Short of introducing a complete translation here, it would be hard to give precise details about the nature and scope of this remarkable black book. It claims that its original was in Hebrew, and that it is, as the title would lead us to believe, sacred and not profane magic. In accordance with the belief of high magic, the author states that angels and demons may be used by means of this book, for good or evil. For is it not the same book that was given to Moses, Solomon, and others? Its processes are similar to those found in most grimoires, grammars of the sorcerers. Details are given for casting spells, for conjuring up spirits, for the recovery of lost objects, to produce love or hate. Small wonder that tradition made it binding upon every initiate of this type of magic to communicate no part of it to anyone unless he was himself convinced that the recipient was ready to receive it. To Solomon is also ascribed the much-coveted Grimorium Verum, which contains material from the Key of Solomon, which will be examined in due course. Not only does this small tome contain the true and authentic secrets of Solomon the king, but it was actually discovered in his tomb. By means of it, the sorcerer may prepare himself for the difficult exercise of the art, can make the various instruments which are essential to the difficult art of raising spirits, and can evoke and dismiss a large number of powerful beings. Although the title page says that it was collected and published by Alebek the Egyptian in 1517 at Memphis, it is more likely to date from the 8th century, and was probably printed from a much older manuscript. No collated version of the true grimoire is known, though parts which are missing in this edition are apparently available in the more modern Italian texts. Another important work which was to be found among the prized treasures of every medieval sorcerer was True Black Magic. This, again, was reputed to be taken from Hebrew sources. It is, in fact, derived from Solomon's Key. Noted for its concentration on death spells and works of hatred, it may have been copied from a parallel manuscript to that from which all the more recent versions of the Key spring. Only one edition of this book is known, and that most rarely, the edition of 1750. Like all grimoires, copies can be bought only from collectors or seen at a few libraries. Until these textbooks of sorcery are made more generally available, it will not be easy for students of occultism to compare the interrelation of culture and myth, which resulted in the magical practices in both Europe and the East. Two main forces were responsible for the spread of occult study of Eastern magic in the West, apart from professional magic workers themselves. In the first place, Arab researchers, obeying literally the Prophet's injunction, "Seek knowledge even as far as China," studied and translated whole libraries of Hebrew books, making them available in Arabic, Latin, and Greek through their famed universities in Spain. Western scholars brought this learning to Northern Europe, where occult studies as well as more mundane sciences took root. Quite apart from accounts of magic and magicians buried in little red works on Hebrew life and customs, there is another source from which a mass of data may be obtained: the Bible. During biblical times, Jewish magic recognized several types of operators: diviners who saw visions by scrying and gazing, Genesis chapter 44, verse 5. People who took counsel from images, livers, and so on, another kind of diviner, as in Ezekiel chapter 21, verse 21. Midianites, Numbers chapter 22, verse 7, and diviners among the Philistines, as we see in 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 2. All these had their counterparts among other Oriental nations. Quite a large part of their magical heritage seems to come from the Turanian Mongols which preceded the Assyrians in that area. A wizard, according to Rabbi Akiba, is a person who decides upon lucky and unlucky days for journeys, sowing, and the like. Several Jewish authorities hold that magic arts were learnt during the Egyptian captivity, and these seem to be the type of sorcerers mentioned in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 31, and Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 11. There is, however, a reference to soothsayers and probably astrologers in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 6, chapter 47, verse 13, and elsewhere, which shows that they were a subdivision of the main body of sorcerers. The engravers were people who specialized in the making of talismans, with which Europe became familiar in later days. Large sections of some Western grimoires were devoted to these talismans and their making. Spells, counterspells, possession by demons, and supernatural contests, these are the ingredients of the magical world of the Semites. Most people will recognize such practices as the attempted reading of the writing on the wall, the interpretation of signs as evidences of occultist activity. Perhaps less obvious is the background of the famous magical battle between Moses and Aaron and the Egyptian priest-magicians. It was a well-known trick of the magicians of the day, and still exists in contemporary Egypt, seemingly to convert rods into serpents. What actually happens is this: the viper is put into a state of cataleptic rigidity by pressing its head. It then resembles a staff. When it is thrown down on the ground, the shock rouses it and breaks the hypnotic state. This is what the Egyptians did. As this book is not concerned with apologetics, it is not proposed to discuss the question of whether Aaron's rod, which may have been a similar snake, actually did or did not devour the opponent's staffs. A further reference on this interesting point can be made to such writers as Morey, Lane, and Thompson. Jewish demonology, armed with the accumulated devils and evil spirits of all the civilizations that Israel was heir to, makes impressive reading. Rabbi Menachem knew that devils are so numerous that if they were visible to the naked eye, it would be impossible for man to exist. Not everyone is equally subjected to their attacks, however. It is rabbis that they seek out to torment. The main reason for the wearing of rabbinical cloaks is to ward off elementals. It is possible that the robes which all sorcerers adopt may have this protective aspect and origin. The worst time for contact with spirits is the night, when Igareth flies in company with hundreds of thousands of excited lesser demons, all primed to do evil, and see that it is done. At night, continues this authority, none should sleep alone, lest Lilith work her evil. Lilith, of course, is the biblical succubus who seduces men. There is a very large literature of rabbinical legend about how this spirit took female shape and deceived Adam. She is a devil of Akkadian, far Asian origin, Galal or Keel Galal. Her name in Hebrew and English is derived from the Assyrian Lil or Lilith. One belief among Jewish Kabbalists was that the elusive Most Great Name, the puissant word of power, was Skemhamforas. With its aid, anything magical could be performed. But it could only be used, like the Book of Thoth, by initiates, on pain of awful supernatural punishment. Later Hebrew writers even claim that it was this very same name which was used by Jesus to work miracles. Where demons were implicitly believed to abound, witches and wizards were constantly at work. That many of the reputed witches were in fact mere eccentrics seems possible. At this distance it is hard to know where to start in order to separate one from the other. Take, for example, in the 22nd chapter of Exodus, the famous line, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." What type of witch is this lady of verse 18? Some say that the Hebrew word chasaf, used here, means simply poisoner, which changes the entire meaning. It is similar to the word veneficus, by which it is rendered in the Latin version of the Septuagint. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, that a witch was considered a poisoner, either in a symbolic sense or in actual fact. Many cases are reported in the 16th century of witches who are said to have resorted to poisoning a victim when magical means failed. One such case was the murder of Sir Thomas Overbury. As we have already seen, witchcraft was distinctly disfavored by the established authority of the Hebrew Semites. But like many another forbidden thing, it nevertheless permeated human life of the period. Those who did not subscribe to the scriptures provided recruits for the cult. Even among believers, history shows that times of stress and doubt would cause otherwise devout people to dabble in witchcraft. Theologians recognize this link between a reduction of faith and a turning towards dark, i.e. magical, arts. And, of course, Job's virtue was tested by a succession of disasters. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 10 says, "There shall not be found among you any one that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of the times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer." Manasseh, according to 2 Kings chapter 21, caused his son to pass through fire. The Arabs of today sometimes pass over a flame in order to discourage any evil spirit that may be following. The same king of Judah observed times and used enchantments and dealt with familiar spirits and wizards, altogether a type of magician king. Saul, king of Israel, discouraged at the trend of affairs and disappointed in his subjects, had given up hope of receiving replies from God, and was driven to consult the witch of Endor. In his own trouble, he forgot that he had himself often sought out witches and killed them. He was told by the witch that she saw an old man wearing a mantle, no actual materialization here, it seems, whose description was recognized by the king. Sinking upon his knees, Saul listened to what seems to have been the voice of Samuel, which he heard but could not see anything, telling of his own defeat and death. This return to the traditional practice of kings to consult, even to maintain, magicians and sorcerers may have been the most reprehensible by monotheistic standards. It could not equally be said to be unprecedented. Magicians, like the practitioners of other arts, have from time immemorial basked in the benign patronage of monarchs. One comes across indications which show not only the power wielded by wonder workers, but the fact that the rewards could be great indeed. Perhaps one of the largest sums paid to a seer was when Ben-Hadad, king of Damascus, gave 40 camel loads of wealth to Elijah in return for discovering whether his illness would prove fatal. The great stream of Jewish magic stretches, in its modern form, far from the eastern Mediterranean shores. A worthy descendant of those biblical seers was the amazing Nostradamus, who remains an enigma even today. So little disbelieved are his strange prophecies that a film was recently made to illustrate some that had come true. Born at the beginning of the 16th century in Provence, he claimed descent on his maternal side from a physician-seer to King René. From his early years he had shown an aptitude for magic. At the age of 10 he was giving lessons in hidden things to people of twice his age, in spite of the fact that his father disapproved and wanted him to take up a medical career. Be that as it may, Nostradamus grew into a handsome, bearded man, and in the year 1525, when he was but 22, plague followed famine, and the district was swept with both. Doctors were few, and he set out with a cure which he had developed. The result was a succession of spectacular recoveries. He would not, or could not, explain the basis of the remedy to doctors, who knew only that he had a secret powder and that it worked. He was therefore given an honorary doctorate in medicine and continued his studies in the occult. The next strange thing about him was that he seemed to develop a power of prescience. There is no indication as to how the power worked. Naturally, he was suspected of being in league with Satan, and another plague burst upon the people in the midst of the accusations, to which he would not deign to reply. The scourge was attributed to Nostradamus himself, but he overcame the disease, carrying his powder into places whence all recognized physicians had fled. A pension was pressed upon him by grateful townspeople. After he had combated another plague in Lyon, again been accused of sorcery, and made a number of further predictions, Nostradamus was called to King Henry's court and appointed the royal physician. The only clue to the possible background of his studies is the recorded drawing of the horoscope of the king, and the assertion that his studies were mainly in Kabbalism, that esoteric philosophy of the Jews. Kabbalism was studied, and its results practiced, in secret. Its literature, like that of the Sufis and other philosophers in the realms of the so-called high tradition, was plentifully adorned with symbolism. Next to alchemy, there is probably no subject which is more difficult of understanding to the uninitiated, even in its terminology. Power, it was held, hid itself from publicity. It was to be obtained only in secrecy and through secrecy. Similarly, its use was to be secret. Even the teachings themselves were actually weakened by being told to incredulous people. Knowledge is power, and knowledge shared is power lost. Silence, discretion, faithfulness, these were the hallmarks of the Kabbalistic student. All good emanated from one point, which is called God in Kabbalism. Equally, all good power was reached and exercised only through this point. The power and characteristics of God were divided into 10 categories, the Sephiroth. These esoteric secrets were matched, and at times equated, with other systems, Jewish and non-Semite, both during the Eastern and Western heydays of occult practice. The Gnostics used gems and ciphers to conceal what they believed to be great truths. Some groups of masters taught their disciples that the symbolism of their rites was divinely revealed in dreams, others that they were merely receptacles for the quintessence of wisdom, crystallized by eons of study and illumination. With the Jews, as with other peoples, angels were known in multitudes, good and bad ones. Dreams and portents all had their proper and improper places. The Platonists believed in the angels that failed, there being as many in the inferior as the superior world. These are prototypes for apparitions and familiar spirits. There is the revenge of the wicked and the godless, evil and wicked spirits willing and anxious to hurt and affright. 4 mischievous kings rule over them. They inhabit places near the earth, yet within the earth itself. Others divide these evil spirits into 9 degrees. The first are false gods who succeed in being worshipped and require sacrifice. Such, they said, was the one who spoke to Jesus, showing him all the kingdoms of the world. And a similar tale is told of Muhammad and the evil spirit who tried to pervert his mission. In the second place are the spirits of lies, such as went from the mouth of Ahab. The third are the vessels of iniquity. We are told in Genesis how Jacob said, "Vessels of iniquity are in their habitations. Into their council let not my soul come." Fourthly, in later Jewish Christian thought, there follow the revengers of evil who imitate miracles and serve witches and sorcerers. Such, it was said, spoke to Eve. Their prince is Satan, who seduces the whole world, doing great signs and causing fire to descend from heaven in the sight of men. Sixthly are those that join themselves with thunder and lightning, corrupting the air and causing pestilence and other evils, the spirits that were thought to aid Nostradamus. They have power over the land and sea, controlling the 4 winds. Their prince is Merimim, a raging, boiling devil, called the Prince of the Power of the Air. Francis Barrett, the last of the great self-confessed wizards, wrote in the early 19th century about these powers, and about their revelation of themselves to man in diverse ways, of prophecies, symbols and signs, and the whole gamut of magic of the West, almost all inherited from Jewish sources. The soul, says the Magus, can receive true oracles and undoubtedly, in dreams, yields true prophecies, wherein unknown places and unknown men appear, both alive and dead. Things to come are foretold, yet there are those whose intellect, being overwhelmed with too much commerce of the flesh, is indeed asleep, or its imagination is too dull that it cannot receive the species and representation which flow from superior intellect, which means, I say, this man is altogether unfit to receive dreams and prophesying by them. Dreams, then, are regarded by this adept, as by his predecessors and confreres throughout the world, as valuable avenues for the transmission of occult knowledge. Some of the more modern psychological anthropologists even suggest that it is to the dream that we must look for the very inception of a human belief in the supernatural. Dreams may well have been the first thing which caused man to suspect that there might be other worlds and beings worth communicating with. Several processes are recorded in Jewish and other magical writings for the procuring of dreams, and they have always played their part in occultism.